A Fundação da Liberdade Econômica, FLE, é um centro de pensamento, produção de conhecimento e formação de lideranças políticas que se baseia na defesa do liberalismo econômico e do conservadorismo como forma de gestão. Para mais informações, acesse flebrasil.org.br. Olá a todos, eu sou Carolina Valente, consultora internacional da Fundação da Liberdade Econômica, e hoje nós vamos realizar mais uma edição internacional dos webinários da Fundação. A Fundação é um centro de pensamento brasileiro, com sede em Brasília, capital do Brasil. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos a esse nosso webinar. A ideia com esse evento internacional é ouvir e compartilhar experiências com diferentes atores do cenário internacional sobre o tema liberalismo econômico e conservadorismo. Nesse sentido, os nossos convidados de hoje fazem parte de uma instituição internacional mundialmente conhecida, com a qual a Fundação recentemente estabeleceu uma parceria de cooperação mútua para ampliação de sua atuação internacional, que é a The Heritage Foundation, que tem sede na capital dos Estados Unidos, Washington, D.C. A Heritage Foundation é uma das maiores organizações de pesquisa de políticas públicas dos Estados Unidos. É um think tank fundado em 1973, cuja missão é formular e promover políticas públicas conservadoras baseadas nos princípios da livre iniciativa, governo limitado, liberdade individual, valores tradicionais americanos e um forte senso de defesa nacional. Um dos principais pilares em que eles acreditam é que vale a pena conservar e renovar os princípios e ideias da Fundação Americana para construir uma América onde a liberdade, a oportunidade, a prosperidade e a sociedade civil floresçam. As pesquisas realizadas pelas equipes da Heritage são amplamente divulgadas para o seu público principal, que são membros do Congresso americano, os formuladores de políticas públicas, especialmente aqueles no Poder Executivo, veículos de comunicação, bem como a comunidade acadêmica. Para conhecer melhor a The Heritage Foundation, vocês podem acessar o site deles, que é www.heritage.org. A Heritage recentemente lançou um relatório que nós aqui da FLE achamos muito interessante, que é o relatório da transparência da China. Eu vou até pedir aqui para a nossa equipe colocar o link para vocês acessarem diretamente esse relatório, que eu li todo, muito interessante, que ele está no www.heritage.org/CTP, que é de China Transparency Project. Para falar sobre esse assunto, nós convidamos dois pesquisadores da Heritage Foundation, o Dr. Dean Cheng e o Dr. Michael Cunningham. E para contribuir com os debates, nós convidamos um dos experts da Fundação da Liberdade Econômica, o Dr. Embaixador Márcio Cambraia. Dr. Cheng é pesquisador sênior do Centro de Estudos Asiáticos para o tema China, sendo especialista em política militar e externa da China, além de grande conhecedor das capacidades militares, espaciais e de segurança da China, em particular sobre o seu relacionamento com o resto da Ásia e com os Estados Unidos. Já o Dr. Michael Cunningham é pesquisador visitante no Centro de Estudos Asiáticos da The Heritage Foundation. Ele é especialista em política chinesa e recentemente publicou um artigo intitulado Looking Ahead to China's 20th Part Congress, que é considerado por ele o evento político mais importante da década. Do nosso lado, aqui da Fundação da Liberdade Econômica, o nosso convidado é o Dr. Márcio Cambraia, que é um diplomata de carreira, embaixador, já serviu em vários postos do Brasil, no exterior, como em Montevidéu, Londres, Madrid, Roma e Praga. Ele é professor de Ciência Política e Relações Internacionais da Universidade de Brasília, lecionou também no Instituto Rio Branco do Ministério das Relações Exteriores e é autor do livro Jogos do Poder, Como Entender e Analisar a Realidade Política de um Mundo em Transformação. Caros Dean, Michael e Dr. Márcio, é uma satisfação recebê-los em nosso webinar internacional da Fundação da Liberdade Econômica. Sejam muito bem-vindos. Doctors, Dean, Michael, and Marcio, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It's an honor to have you all here with us today.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, let's start with you, Mr. Dean. I would start and ask, could you tell us, in general terms, about the high priority that the Heritage Foundation puts on China and this China-U.S. relations as a subject for policy research and analysis, please?
So the Heritage Foundation is one of the older think tanks here in Washington. We have tended to focus on Congress and therefore on issues of key interest to both the executive branch and the legislative branch. And today, there is probably no single topic of greater importance than China, if only because China touches on so many other topics. China is a factor in global food production and markets, global energy demand. China's military has been expanding. China's investments abroad, including in Brazil, but also in the United States, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. Chinese cyber activities and space activities. So as we look forward deeper into the 21st century, it is very clear that how China is likely to develop, what policies it is likely to pursue, are of absolute interest to the United States, and therefore U.S.-China relations in turn will have a broader impact. If they are unfriendly, they will have repercussions around the world. If they are friendly, they will have repercussions around the world. And so the Heritage Foundation, given that we try to have some influence on both the legislative and the executive branches, is very much focused on trying to better understand China's thinking and the implications for U.S. policy.
Very interesting. Thank you, Dean. Well, Mr. Michael, regarding your China Transparency Project, I want to start quoting a very interesting point for your report. I read all of them. It's very interesting. And, well, the quote is, "The COVID-19 pandemic has been one of the most devastating global crises of our time. With millions of lives lost and unprecedented economic devastation, there are many questions that must be answered to ensure that such a tragedy never happens again. But we cannot get those answers without greater transparency from China, where the virus originated. So, that is my question. Do you believe that the lack of transparency of the Chinese government under the governance of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is responsible or even can be held accountable for this global crisis?"
Yes, thanks for that question. The answer is yes. China's lack of transparency is absolutely responsible for the pandemic. We'll likely never know where the virus, how the virus came about. China will not be transparent enough for that. But regardless of the origins of the virus, China's government is responsible and should be held accountable for turning what was really a localized outbreak into a global pandemic. I actually watched this develop from on the ground in China. I lived in China during the time. I first heard the rumors in late 2019 that there was a SARS-like viral pneumonia that was spreading in Wuhan. And the Chinese government heard the rumors as well.
In 2018?
2019.
In 2019, oh, okay.
That's right. And the Chinese government was suppressing this information, saying it was just malicious rumors. They were threatening people that shared the information. There was a doctor, Li Wenliang, who was actually called in by the police and threatened and forced to sign a pledge that he would not speak anymore about the virus just because he had sent a message in social media warning other doctors to take precautions and wear protective gear because there was this virus. And when the government finally admitted that there was a virus, they said, "Don't worry, there's no human-to-human transmission." The World Health Organization believed China. They parroted that line. Later speeches by Xi Jinping make it clear that he knew that the virus was spread between humans at least 2 weeks before finally issuing a public warning. And so, whatever the reason for this lack of transparency, and it's not, we don't have to read too much into it. It's very much in line with China's regular practice to suppress information that it fears is going to cause mass hysteria or panic, or that will disrupt the economy or tarnish China's global image. But regardless of the reason that the information was suppressed, China's other provinces were unprepared for it. When the government finally admitted that it's highly contagious, and they locked down Hubei province, the other provinces weren't prepared. They didn't, that actually resulted in the virus just spreading like wildfire throughout China. The international community was kept in the dark the entire time. The international business community, which I was working with at the time, believed the official line, and so they weren't worried at all. There was no time before the government finally came out and said it's a health crisis. There was no time for foreign governments to put measures in place. And so really it was only a few governments that knew better than to trust Beijing, like Taiwan, that were able to put measures in place to prevent major outbreaks in their jurisdictions. So yes, by all means, unfortunately, regardless of the origins of COVID-19, the CCP is directly responsible for the global pandemic. It is one of the clearest ways China's lack of transparency affects the world.
I'm curious right now. I was not clear for me. Did you remain there during the lockdowns and the pandemic?
Yeah, so I actually benefited from the fact that the international community was not prepared for it. I managed to get on the last flight out of China to a Southeast Asian country, and I spent a couple of months there working actually at a COVID-19, a pandemic crisis center for a client I was working with at the time. But I stayed out of the country for about 2 months, and then when China was closing its borders, I went back. So then I was living in China until last year. So I saw a lot of the sort of the developments. But like the latest lockdowns, I have not experienced any of that.
How interesting. Thanks for sharing. Well, our next question. On the report, you've mentioned that the need for transparency does not stop with COVID-19. And I will quote again the report. You say the pandemic was a monumental and much needed turning point in US-China relations. Instead of a chain reaction of calls for greater accountability and transparency from the CCP, not just in public health issues, but in politics and laws, human rights, its military, foreign policy, economics, and more. What is the role of the Heritage Foundation on this sense, gathering this data and pushing for more transparency in China? Who prefer to comment on this one? Mr. Dean?
Yep.
Okay.
So, one of the things that the pandemic brought forth was obviously that China is not transparent. And I think many people understood that at some level. But there was always the expectation that, especially in the wake of the SARS crisis, and also the hope that as China became more integrated economically, that there would be greater transparency in certain areas. And with the realization from the COVID pandemic that maybe there isn't, the Heritage Foundation took up the task of trying to highlight transparency in different silos, in different areas. And so the report is split into multiple chapters, each looking at a different aspect. And one of the really surprising things that has come out from this report is, one, that China is in some ways more transparent sometimes than we realize. That people who specialize in human rights or economics or trade, as opposed to economics, or in defense, each have very specialized knowledge that other specialties often are unaware of. Often there are methodologies that one group will use that another group may not have thought to use. And so this has promoted the opportunity to both learn, oh, there are sources of data in topic area A or B or C, and two, there are interesting methodologies, and both might be able to be ported over among the various different fields. But the other piece that is very, very clear is that at the end of the day, while China is a little more transparent than we sometimes think, it is nowhere near as transparent as we need it to be. And that is true whether it is in the financial world, the economic world, the health world. The defense world has always known that China is not transparent. But as we have watched, for example, the discovery of several hundred missile silos in western China, as China's Navy has built itself out, as it has demonstrated in recent military exercises much greater capabilities, I think that that has highlighted how little we actually know about Chinese capabilities, even when it comes to such things as nuclear missiles and things like that. So the Heritage Foundation really, it's very important to note, none of these chapters are entirely heritage, right? What we have done is we have tried to highlight the work of various think tanks, not just American ones, but internationally, to help bring to everyone, look at all of the different groups, data, methodologies out there to try and spread, sort of cross-fertilize and help various groups get a better insight into the big puzzle box that is China.
That's a very interesting answer and surprising one. I think it was curious for me to hear about that. That's more transparent in some ways that we can imagine.
Because at the end of the day, China does interact with the West. China's companies do list on foreign stock exchanges. China does publish reports and studies on a variety of aspects. So, for example, one of the areas that I specialize in is China's military. And while there is nowhere near as much information about China's military as from a democracy, United States, Japan, South Korea, nonetheless, a military of 2 million has to publish things simply for its own forces that cannot be totally classified. And if you are able to, one, obtain those documents, journal articles, etc., and two, can read it in Chinese because the Chinese don't provide translations, then you can gain some insight into the PLA's thinking. This emergence of commercial satellite photography has been an enormous opportunity to learn more about China's activities in the South China Sea, in its border with India, Uyghur prison camps, all of these sorts of things. We see a little bit of this in the Russia-Ukraine war, just the sheer amount of data that is suddenly available if you're willing to go to a satellite company and say, I want to purchase photographs. Again, that is a fascinating new field that 30 years ago was only done by governments, and today can be done by different think tanks. And again, Heritage is not doing it itself, but is trying to bring to everyone's attention, look at CSIS, look at these other think tanks. They are looking at that.
Very interesting. I have once the opportunity to visit a satellite facility in China. And it was open, they received us, but I think it's challenging as they just speak in Chinese to put together all the informations.
Yes.
I really like your explanation. Thank you, Doctor. Well, the next question. Once more, I want to highlight an aspect of your report, a very good one, as I said. You said the U.S. and China relations will continue to be one of the most important issues for decades to come. The U.S. now faces a different China from a decade ago. The emboldened leadership in Beijing has become increasingly aggressive, and in many ways it is a threat to America, its interests, and its whole in the world. It is not the Chinese people that are in fault. I really like this phrase of yours. So what I would like to ask is, in your view, what are the implications to the world of the rising relationship and perceived geopolitical or great power competition between United States and China? Who prefer to comment on this one?
Growing capability of the PRC is visible, for example, in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Xi Jinping is meeting with Vladimir Putin. In doing so, the simple act of meeting without any promises, without any commitments, means that Vladimir Putin and Russia is less isolated. It is a signal to Russia that its behavior is not necessarily going to be punished by a key partner. China refers to Russia's action as a special military operation, which is exactly how the Russians describe it, which again lends legitimacy. Frankly, the Chinese trade with Russia has probably been a key part of why Russia has been able to sustain the massive losses and the economic suffering that the sanctions imposed by the rest of the world has placed upon the Russian people. So all of this adds up to China being able to make a difference because it is the number 2 economy in the world, because it is a member of the United Nations permanent membership on the Security Council, because it is a key part of many, many countries' supply chains and trading partnerships. So this growth in China's capabilities, coupled with the actions and attitudes of the Chinese Communist Party, which is primarily oriented first in maintaining power, to expanding China's power, and third, doing so in ways that really challenge the rules of the international order, whether it is intellectual property and respect for it, whether it is human rights and a general sense of how people should deal with each other, even, again, bringing it back to COVID, the reality that public health is a common good, that all of us need to share information if we want to keep all of us healthy. China doesn't seem to see the world that way. And by not acting that way, it's one thing if it was Andorra or Liechtenstein, but when you are the number 2 economy in the world, when you are the most populous country in the world, your actions have outsized consequences. And that is the problem that China poses, is that it is playing by its own rules, and those have international consequences.
Very interesting, Dr. Cheng. And I will address the next one to you as well. You divided your report in 8 categories. The first one was the economy. The second, energy and the environment. Number 3, human rights. 4, influence operations. 5, the military. 6, outbound investments. 7, politics and law. And 8, technology. You've mentioned that the Chinese government has a history of withholding, manipulating, and falsifying data for its own purposes. And these are all very sensitive topics, of course. Given this, can you describe the challenges to accessing reliable information on the internet or in open sources to provide an accurate analysis? I think you already say something about that, but maybe you can complement right now.
Sure. So China does view its information as, in a sense, proprietary, all information. How many tons of coal does it mine? What is the size of the military budget? What is the size of their space budget? So in that regard, the first challenge then is simply being able to read Chinese, because the Chinese quite reasonably say, we publish an enormous amount of material, which they do, but surely you don't expect us to translate it into English, into Portuguese, into German, into French, into Russian. And so the number of Americans, at least, who read and speak Chinese is very, very small, relatively speaking, to a country of 1.3 billion, to the number 2 GDP in the world. We are frankly very fortunate that our China staff here, for the most part, does in fact read and speak Chinese. That is not always true. Then the second issue becomes, of course, that even if you can read it, can you access documentation? And there, the Chinese go to great lengths often to make sure that documents are very hard to find, where data is very hard to find. So it's not just a matter of finding it in, being able to read it, but being able to get access to it. And when you publish, in a sense, you are telling the Chinese, especially if you footnote, oh, these are the documents, these are the websites that I have used. And very quickly, those documents become inaccessible, become classified, or simply are never issued again. And the same is true for websites. We had a colleague who used to assemble Chinese energy usage based upon a combination of national and local data involving coal imports and consumption rates. As he published annual reports on this, all of a sudden the Chinese stopped publishing all of their local, provincial level coal production and consumption reports. And he was no longer able to produce reports on coal because the national numbers were often much too aggregated and also were of uncertain reliability. And then a third part to this is the spate of Chinese laws that have come out over the last 10 to 15 years, where China now officially says two things. On the one hand, all of your data, China has a right to demand, especially if you are based in China. And conversely, it has the right to control or manage a lot of data in the name of national security. In fact, when you look at how China defines national security, almost nothing escapes that umbrella. And so it is now legally in their system perfectly reasonable to say, you can't publish this. You can't report on this. We don't want you to report on this because it's a matter of national security, national cybersecurity, national terrorism security, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So China is constantly constraining how much information others can access and couples that with the reality that not enough people, frankly, read and speak Chinese.
Well, how challenging is that? Thank you. The next one I will address to Dr. Michael. There is a very interesting article on your report analyzing the Chinese influence and the exploitation of the U.S. colleges and universities. You've mentioned some Chinese formal programs to encourage foreign trained talent to return to China and the influence of the Confucius Institutes we have here in Brazil as well. What are the repercussions of this influence on American education, please?
Yeah, so Chinese infiltration of universities basically has been happening since China started sending students abroad in the late 1970s. It's most prominent in the U.S. because the U.S. has the largest number of Chinese students, the most, in general, the most cutting-edge research, the highest profile universities. But it does happen throughout the world. And as you mentioned, Brazil having Confucius Institutes, it's probably happening in Brazil as well. Part of China's influence over universities is just simply the natural result of being the largest source of foreign students, most of whom are paying full tuition. They're not getting big scholarships from the universities, but their wealthy parents are paying their way. And so no university wants to tarnish their reputation in China by taking a public stance against the Chinese government, by not doing sort of what they think Beijing wants them to do. And so a lot of it is sort of, not directly related to action directly taken by Beijing, but a lot of it is. And you've mentioned some of these examples, the talent programs, Confucius Institutes, which are used to influence how China is seen abroad, drive its soft power. They likely have links to espionage. That's a little less concrete. There's also something called Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, which are directly funded and overseen by Chinese embassies and consulates. They provide a lot of good social services for Chinese students studying abroad. They're also used to monitor Chinese students studying abroad and to enforce censorship on those students and sometimes on the universities. It's not unheard of for the CSSA leadership to go around and tear down flyers that they don't like that refer to Chinese human rights violations, for example. Donations and partnerships with universities by Chinese government organizations, or more commonly Chinese universities and businesses. For an idea of how much this is, $1 billion reported between 2013 and 2020 from Chinese sources, and that's just what was reported. It's notoriously underreported by Chinese universities. And these donations and partnerships, they're not free. The U.S. Department of Education has conducted studies. They've seen that foreign contributions generally, not specific to China, affect research and teaching. So it's often hard to draw a concrete cause and effect, but here's what we do see happening at U.S. colleges and universities. Espionage and intellectual property theft. Sometimes it's not even outright theft. Sometimes it's research collaboration on issues that do not seem to be a really big deal because they're just one small component of key technologies. But when you've got several of these cooperations happening across multiple universities, it ends up they're able to use it to develop some pretty cutting edge technologies that sometimes have military applications. We've got universities that are afraid to host events that are likely to upset Beijing. We've got the breakdown of free speech and academic freedom, not only linked to Beijing, but a lot of it is clearly linked to Beijing. I mean, we've got professors, I hear professors complain all the time about how it's hard to teach about China, about how a minority of students from China will use violence, hate speech, antagonize other Chinese students who are a little more free-thinking, or antagonize U.S. students who speak critically of China, or Hong Kong, Taiwan students. An example that I can share is in Cornell University. There was a Uyghur student who, during a public event on campus, stood up and asked a question. And during her question, she mentioned that one of her brothers was in a re-education camp in Xinjiang. And when she started talking about that, she was jeered and taunted by dozens of Chinese students, and who the Chinese students then walked out. The university then sent an email to everyone explaining that the walkout and the reaction by the Chinese students was an appropriate form of expressing their discontent with the person asking the question, and the Uyghur student said she felt very unsafe because of this issue. And so that's just one example of sort of how China's influence on universities are sort of afraid to push back and to ensure the freedom of expression and other really constitutional rights that students should have and that professors should have on campuses.
How sad it was, this example. I find out this article in your report very interesting. I highly recommend everyone is seeing us to read it, about the Confucius Institute and the influence on American education. Yeah? Well, going to our last question, addressed to Dr. Michael Cunningham. I would like to take advantage on Mr. Cunningham's expertise to talk about an important upcoming issue in China's politics and China's current intense challenges with the economy, with COVID, interest in the deliberations and outcome of the party congress is much higher than it might be usually. Could you talk a little about the role of party congresses in Chinese politics?
Yes, I love talking about this. So 3 things generally happen at party congresses. There are leadership appointments, and we're not just talking the general secretary, who is Xi Jinping. We're talking also all senior party leadership. The Politburo, which currently has 25 members, and its standing committee, currently 7 members, which are really the top leaders in China. The party constitution is amended. That's not China's constitution. It is the party's constitution. We sometimes call it the party charter. And policy priorities are set for the next 5 years. We can't always look forward and know exactly what's going to happen, but things almost always make sense in retrospect if we read that report. So it's super important. The CCP believes the elite in the party believed that the party was really on the brink of collapse back in 2012. But now it's stronger than ever. He's also taken a lot of measures to make structural changes to the economy that his predecessors were not able to do. I would say briefly, China's policy trajectory over the next 5 years is going to be very similar to what we've seen. So we'll continue to see an emphasis on the quality rather than the quantity of economic development, on spreading the wealth more throughout rural regions, not just urban areas, a huge drive for technology development, a confrontational foreign policy. None of this is likely to end.
Thank you. Very interesting predictions. Well, now I want to invite our expert from the FLE, our foundation, Ambassador Cambraia, if you want to address some questions or share any thoughts with our guests today.
Thank you very much. I want to take advantage of the knowledge of the both professors, Dr. Chang and Dr. Cunningham, to satisfy some curiosity of myself. I think that the international scenario is going to be essentially bipolar in the near future, and with 2 main superpowers. The United States of America, of course, and China, and some middle-sized powers like France, like United Kingdom, and Russia. And moreover, some regional powers, like, for example, India and Brazil. I wonder if the United States will not be stretching their resources, defining an economic superpower and a military power like Russia, an economic superpower like China, and a military power like Russia at the same time. Because in the Cold War, China was not what is China today, could be a bit of overstretching their resources and, defying two military powers, one superpower, economic superpower, and trying to keep its hegemony as well.
Who wants to comment? Mr. Sheng?
I think the ambassador has certainly identified one of the key challenges. We have not faced ever, really, a nation who was the number 2 economy who was challenging the underpinnings of the international economic system. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union was, for the most part, autarkic. It did not trade with other people. It didn't need to trade with other people, and above all, it did not want to trade with other people. So it was almost irrelevant economically. And so you had GATT, you had various efforts to build a global free trade system that would basically ignore the Soviet Union and its allies. And most of those allies didn't trade with other people. Cuba, North Korea, etc. China is part of everyone's supply chains, but it doesn't respect international rules on intellectual property and the like. And so what the ambassador has identified is fundamental to this. How do you deal? How does the United States deal? But also, how does the West, how does a system that is built upon rule of law, sometimes incomplete, always imperfect, but for the most part believing in the concepts of democracy and rule of law, deal with a huge player that is economically integrated but does not believe in the rule of law? I think it is important to recognize that while the military plays a part in this, the Cold War became almost entirely a military competition. And that is probably not how to deal with China. Now, again, as the ambassador noted, what we do have is an unholy alliance, if you will, between a Russia whose only strength at this point really is military. And even that strength, as we have seen in Ukraine, is not nearly as powerful as we thought. And an economic and growing technological power, that is China, that is more than happy to let Russia go and invade other countries. And while China does threaten places like Taiwan and the South China Seas, it hasn't fought a war itself in over 40 years. So I wish I had a good answer to the ambassador's challenge, to the ambassador's question. I don't. I wish I did. But I do think that one real answer is that the United States is not the only country that has to answer or can answer this. That it does need to work with long-standing allies, but also the up-and-coming countries that the ambassador mentioned, Brazil, India. I mean, it is interesting to think that even though this was simply a Goldman Sachs title, BRICS, the reality is that these are all up-and-coming countries in the sense that they are economies that are vibrant and growing, or were in the case of Russia. But at the end of the day, it was never clear what drew these countries together, if anything. And we know that, for example, between India and China, there's as much rivalry as there is partnership. Brazil is a very different case. Brazil and China, one of the things I focus on is China's space program. And it is noteworthy how much China and Brazil have cooperated over the course of the last 30 years in space. And that is an interesting challenge, whether Brazil gets what it wants out of this relationship, whether China gets what it wants out of this relationship, and going forward, where that relationship is likely to head. And this is true, again, for a variety of technologies. I think that India is wrestling with the problem of it would like to work with China, huge economy, but national security issues ranging from territory to cybersecurity militate towards a much more careful case-by-case cooperative basis. So it isn't just the United States that has to confront this problem, but I think that the solution has to lie in a much broader international approach to China.
I would, if I could just add to that, I think Dean is 100% correct. I would even say that China's diplomacy and its sort of attempt to drive its political leadership, which is sort of what it's doing more so than than militarily. It's using economics and political influence to drive sort of or create an alternative bloc, alternative norms. And the countries that it is really targeting are, as Dean said, the up-and-coming countries, the developing countries, and so Africa, South America, as really the biggest economy of South America, Brazil is very much a target of these, not military coercion by any means, but of this sort of economic and political enticement effort by China.
Very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Chang. Cunningham, maybe it will be the last one, Ambassador.
Okay.
Regarding the time. Okay, thank you.
Do you think that would it be possible for the West to kind of try to attract China for the Western economic system, because the United States and China, they have a kind of symbiosis, a kind of very, very strong relationship, in commercial terms, in trade, in industry, investments, etc. And so the West had this opportunity of attracting the collapsed Soviet Union, which transformed in Russia, of course, at the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this opportunity was lost. And the West tried to isolate Russia. And now we have two paths, either cooperation with China or the state of belligerency with China. And I ask you both, if I may, if you think that it could still be possible to kind of attract China, because as far as I know, the government of China is trying to get to get better way of living, standard of living of this huge population, and so it could be an opportunity. What do you think about it? Is it possible yet? No.
Well, Michael lived there and has worked with the Chinese, so I think that he should definitely take the first swing at that one.
Yeah, I'll take the first swing. Thank you, Ambassador, and I'm really quite disappointed to report my my opinion and observation, which is that we tried. That was what our engagement over the past several decades was based on. And unfortunately, China is interested in taking advantage of economic outreach, but it's not interested in playing by the rules of the international system. Now, the U.S. was naive for several decades. U.S. policy sort of ignored this and thought, okay, if we just pull them into the global trading system, they are going to become our ally. They might even become democratic, and that was never the intention of the Chinese government. Now that we have Xi Jinping, sort of one of the benefits that the international community gets from that is actually seeing more clearly what how China really views its cooperation and its role in the world. And so, I would say, unfortunately, but I don't think there's much appetite on either side for deepening economic integration and collaboration. I think it's pretty clear that no matter how many economic carrots we hold out at China, they will always assume that we're trying to bring them down, trying to hold them down. They never take our goodwill for what it really is, and that's really unfortunate. Now, on the individual level, Chinese individuals and many Chinese businesses would love more normal collaboration between the U.S. and China. In some ways, the U.S. and China are natural allies, but unfortunately, the CCP is not interested in that. If the U.S. were not working to decouple from China as well, China would be driving that very much, but they'd be trying to drive it on their own terms. As soon as they do not rely on the U.S. for a certain technology, U.S. firms in that industry are, no longer welcomed with open arms in China. So unfortunately, that's how I see it. Maybe Dean has different thoughts.
No, I agree with what Michael said. What I want to throw in addition is the underlying attitude of the ambassador's question, which you also hear a great deal of in the United States, especially in the 1990s, was that we would make China more like us. And there's nothing wrong with that from our point of view, because we like who we are. If you don't like who you are, that's a different issue. But China likes who it is. And that, I think, everything Michael said, I totally agree with. But there's this additional fundamental psychological challenge, which is, why would China want to become more like us? We would say, well, rule of law, human rights, these are all good things. And the Chinese attitude is, well, that's fine for you, but from our perspective, we are perfectly happy being who we are. And we want to make the Uyghurs more like us. We want to make the people of Hong Kong more like us. But by more like us, more like China, not more like the West. In fact, that's part of the problem with the Hong Kongese, is they're too much like the West. They need to be brought to heel. And this larger cultural challenge is one that is not limited to China. I would suggest that if we look at Iran and some other places, they have the same problem, which is to say, we do not want to become like the West. We want the technology, we want the industry, we want the economics, we want the efficiencies, we want the computers, but we don't necessarily want to tune in to Netflix. In Iran, of course, they confiscated thousands of satellite dishes. In China, you have the Great Firewall of China. So we want certain pieces, it's cafeteria style, right? We want certain pieces of the West, certain elements of the West, but then go away. Go away if we don't depend on you economically, but go away when you start challenging our cultural identity, our cultural security. And this predates Xi Jinping. Hu Jintao talked a lot about cultural security. And so I fear that, part of the reason why the Chinese are worried and believe that we are trying to subvert their system is because in a very real sense we are. When we say we want to make you like us. And it's useful here to note that the Chinese hear the term peaceful evolution and do not think, well, what's wrong with peaceful evolution? What's wrong with peaceful change? And what they hear is John Foster Dulles saying peaceful evolution will lead to the collapse of communist parties around the world. And so even a term as seemingly innocuous as peaceful evolution, in the Chinese mind, linked to a historical perspective that is different from ours, says, we don't want that. We don't want to be like you. And when you try to make us like you, you make yourself a threat to us.
Well, Ambassador, thank you for your very interesting question, and you both for your great answers. Well, I don't know you, but I really enjoy it. I really enjoy our conversation today. I think it was a very interesting webinar, and I want to thank you all, doctors, Dean Cheng, Michael Cunningham, Ambassador Márcio Cambraia. I want to thank Katy from the Heritage Foundation as well. She helped us to organize in this event. And I want to say that we are very honored to celebrate today this collaboration that we are initiating. So please feel free to share your final considerations.
Well, on behalf of the Heritage Foundation, I do want to say thank you for the opportunity to have this joint podcast. We look forward very much to future cooperation, podcasts, conferences, collaboration on research projects. I think that there is a great deal of opportunity between your organization and ours to share perspectives and hopefully inform both of our respective, not just governments, but polities about these issues that are a challenge to all of us.
I echo Dean's sentiments. This has been, I think, just a fascinating, really enjoyable conversation. I hope it's the first of many, and I just wish we would have had more time to hear more of the ambassador's questions and to have had a more discussion. But I'm sure there will be other opportunities. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and very nice to meet you both.
Hope next time we have more time, indeed, Michael. E agradecer aqui em português, muito obrigada aos doutores Cheng, Cunningham, o nosso embaixador, expert da Fundação, o embaixador Cambraia, pela participação de todos vocês no nosso Webinar Internacional, que foi um podcast internacional aqui. E para você que acabou de nos acompanhar, muito obrigada pela sua audiência. Para mais informações, acesse o site flebrasil.org.br e siga as nossas redes sociais no Facebook e no Instagram, que é @FLEconômica, e no Twitter é @FLEbrasil. Além disso, acompanhe também os nossos outros podcasts, inclusive os gravados aqui no Brasil. Eles estão disponíveis na sua plataforma de áudio favorita, Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Castbox e Deezer. Eu sou Carolina Valente, consultora internacional da Fundação da Liberdade Econômica, e esse foi o nosso Webinar Internacional. Um grande abraço e até a nossa próxima conversa. Muito obrigada!